The first century Corinthian church had its share of problems, but they could all be boiled down to one, and that was selfishness or pride, which was leading to disunity in that church. So when Paul comes to chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, he introduces a more excellent way to them, a better way of behaving. Rather than the selfishness, which was their order of life up until that time, Paul says that you should participate in love, which is the opposite of selfishness. Love is an emotion which wills the highest and the best for someone else. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7, Paul gives an almost unparalleled description of love. He doesn't define it so much, but he gives a marvelous description. And then in verse 8, he tells us that love is permanent. And he compares, at that point, love which is permanent to three partial revelatory gifts over which it turns out they were arguing. The gifts of prophecy, tongues, and knowledge. What he tells us there is that there will be a time when prophecy, tongues, and knowledge will cease, when they go away. That time will be whenever the completed has come. Now, it's my view that the completed is completed revelation. He's comparing partial revelation with completed something. I believe that completed something is completed revelation. But the primary point is you have love which is permanent, something they're not doing right now, and they're arguing over something that is temporary. At the end of the chapter, he says that there are three virtues which remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest is love. Again, he is stressing the preeminence of love, the permanence of love, as an answer to their problem. So when he gets to chapter 14, he applies this to the situations in Corinth and also the situations that we find in our churches today. Two words: pursue love. The Greek term there is dioko. It's a very powerful term. It gives us the image of a hunter pursuing its prey. Not just so the hunter could put a trophy on a wall, but so that that hunter could provide dinner, supper, for himself and for his family. It brings to mind this old Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom series that I used to watch as a kid. And I'll never forget, in the opening part of that series, they would always have a lion stretching out and racing across the plain, chasing down an African antelope. And that's the idea of dioko. When they slowed that down and ran it in slow motion, you could see the muscles of the lion just rippling as that lion would stretch out and do everything it could to pursue that antelope so that it could eat dinner. That's what Paul wants us to do. That's what the Holy Spirit, speaking through Paul, wants us to do with respect to our spiritual lives and interpersonal problems. We are to pursue love with the same intensity that that lion pursued that antelope across the African plain. We are to pursue love. We are to will the highest and the best for others, not just when it's convenient, not in a passive way, but we're to actively pursue love. He then goes on in the rest of chapter 14, particularly verses 1 through 19, to compare prophecy, which at that time was almost akin to the gift of pastor-teacher now. It was communicating truth from one person to another or one person to a group, with this idea of speaking in a tongue, which was something the Corinthians were doing that was a bit different. It may not even been the first century gift of tongues as it was practiced on the day of Pentecost, but they were speaking primarily to God in an unknown language. They didn't even know what they were saying to God. And so Paul is saying, first of all, pursue love. And now how would that work? If pursuing love means willing the highest and the best for someone else, then Paul's saying at least you should desire the gift of prophecy because it's communicating truth to someone else. Whereas this language that you're speaking in, that's not helping anybody because it's communicating nothing. If I was to say to you, je voudrais manger quelque chose, unless you spoke French, that didn't communicate anything to you. And by the way, those of you who do speak French, forgive me for butchering the language. But the idea is if you're speaking in a language that someone doesn't understand, there's nothing communicated. So what's the point? Nobody can grow. Nobody's edified. So the way that the Corinthians were practicing this speaking in a tongue, this heavenly language of communication with God the Father that nobody else could translate or discertain, it wasn't helping anybody to grow. So Paul's point is, how is that love? He actually goes on to make a comment about that activity. It says, when people do that, or if I was to do that, he puts it in the form of a conditional clause. If I was to do that, I would be doing it with my spirit but not my mind. Then he goes on to say that's not the way we should worship. We should worship with our spirit and our mind. not just with the Spirit only. When I pray, I should pray with my mind and my spirit. When I sing, I should sing with my mind and my spirit. So it certainly seems as though Paul is discouraging the act even in the first century. And then at the end of the section, chapter 19, Paul says, I would rather speak 5 intelligible words, 5 words that you can understand, than 10,000 words in a tongue. Now that number 10,000 was huge for Greeks, the Greek speakers. They didn't really have a way to say anything higher. That was the highest number that they could come up with. That's why when they wanted to say more, they would say 10,000 upon 10,000s. But what Paul is saying here is, look, this idea of speaking in a language that nobody understands, that's not helping anybody out. It's not benefiting the church, so therefore, it is not an act of love. If it's not an act of love, the way they were doing it was a function of selfishness, and that's not the point. The point of Paul's message in chapter 14, verses 1 through 19, is that they need to desire something that's going to communicate to everybody, so everybody can grow. This idea of a personal prayer life where you don't even know what you're saying is not helping anybody. The idea, pursue love, not in a passive way, but in an aggressive way. Thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you next week.